Great. Everybody hear me okay? Is that going through? Okay. First of all, thank you all for coming and taking time out of your day to come hear this. I want to start off by saying that this is not a conference presentation that I typically give, and that's not my intent here. So this is very much me sharing my intersection of my story and the work that I'm doing, and in the hope that you can take what is of value to you and leave the rest. And with that in mind, if I'm touching on anything that you have questions about, or you think that there's something that you want me to elaborate more on, I'm more than happy to explore anything, so feel free to stop me, and because I don't want this to just be one long monologue on my part, and there'll definitely be time at the end for questions. So first of all, just for who I am. So I graduated in '99. My degree was criminal justice, and I minored in psychology and English. I was in the honors program while I was here, and I also did freshman leaders summer orientation for a couple of years, and then I was in Orange Keys toward the end. So I had a pretty good crossover between some of the different departments and the different programs, and got to work with a lot of different people while I was here. My intent for this, and kind of how I've structured this, is I'm going to talk about Gavin de Becker Associates, my work with the company, but I'm structuring it so that I'm going to talk about threat assessment in general, kind of catch up chronologically, and I'll tell a little bit about my story while I was here and how that intersection came to be, and kind of where I see threat assessment, where it is now, and where it's going. So that's generally the broad outline that I've kind of put this stuff together as. And just for my general knowledge, first, who's here for extra credit? Just so I get a sense. Anybody getting extra credit for being here? Fair enough, right? And so what classes are getting extra credit for being here, just in general? Like what general areas? Okay. Intro to CJ? Okay. Anybody else? Hey, there we go. Dr. Kircher, when I was here, Understanding Human Behavior. That was one of my favorites. Anybody else? There we go. Yep. That everybody? Okay, cool. And along those lines, is anybody familiar with Gavin de Becker Associates, or read Gift of Fear? Cool, congratulations, thank you. No, and anyway, that's just so I kind of know the baseline of what I'm talking about. So great, so there we go. So what I want to start with, Gavin de Becker Associates in general, and how that came to be, and kind of on that threat landscape and how that came to be, and then I'll circle back to my story, and then we'll kind of pick it up chronologically. If you aren't familiar with Gavin de Becker or the company, he's one of the pioneers of what we refer to now as threat assessment. Gift of Fear was his book that came out back in '97. It kind of introduced a lot of these concepts to a larger public-facing arena with that. And the story, broad strokes of the company, is that Gavin started out in Los Angeles working with public figures in different capacities, and at that time saw the gaps around the types of security that they were getting and the non-existence of any kind of formalized threat assessment program that they would be in. So he was one of the pioneers of collecting these inappropriate communications sent to public figures, and from that developed his methodologies over time that later got shared in Gift of Fear and continue to be out there. So that was late '70s into the 80s. And then what a catalyst for a lot of this from the modern sense, there's always been, attacks on public figures in the media age. That goes back quite a ways. But a lot of the contemporary thinking around this was solidified with the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer, the actress, in 1989. So if you're not familiar with that situation, broad strokes, she was an actress on a sitcom called My Sister Sam. It was a popular show at the time. Young actress, was getting a lot of notoriety for it. And she had an inappropriate pursuer named Robert Bardo. And Bardo had written her some letters. One of those letters she happened to respond to. And Bardo interpreted that as obviously a very personal gesture. He engaged in what we call targeted travel, traveled out to Los Angeles to encounter her. First attempted to encounter 2 other public figures who had security measures in place that deterred him from making contact with them, and then settled on trying to contact Rebecca Schaefer. And in that, he went to the studio where her show was filmed, and the studio security at the time, now bear in mind this is 1989, so a lot of thinking was different, but it was what we call a very intrusive intervention. It was basically, she doesn't know who you are, you need to leave, and they drove him back to his hotel. And it was more than that, but I'm paraphrasing. And so that introduced an element of what we describe as rejection. It changes the overall emotional tone of the pursuit. And at that point, Bardo, hired a private investigator to get her address, which they got from DMV records, which was at the time legal. He goes to her house in the Los Angeles area, knocks on the door. They have a brief encounter, and of course it goes, the way you would expect. She has no idea who this guy is or why he's on her porch. Break off contact. He goes away, works up the nerve, comes back, and shoots her once in the chest, and it's fatal. And from that, the reason that I bring that up is that led to 2 things. One, the creation of the first stalking law in California, which was in 1990, and it also led to the creation of LAPD's Threat Management Unit, which at the time was the only such unit dedicated strictly to public figure, interpersonal violence, kind of what we more contemporarily refer to as threat assessment. Around that same time, the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals was formed, ATAP, which is a current and active organization. It's one of the main, really on the threat assessment side, it's the main professional association. There are also as-is and some others that specialize in corporate security, executive protection, and have some other areas. But ATAP is the main one around threat assessment, or what we refer to as threat assessment. The other change that came out of that is privacy laws were changed, that PIs could no longer directly access address information like that. They tightened up systems around that, and it was just kind of a bellwether around kind of the thinking around that and where some of the thinking was. So again, stalking at the time, it was an old behavior but a new crime, and it was moving into kind of that area. And there are now stalking statutes on the books for all 50 states, and there's a federal equivalent as well. And so the reason I tell all that is that in this space, Gavin de Becker Associates was very active. They were a big player in a lot of this. Bardo actually references Gavin de Becker in his interviews once he was incarcerated, and will continue to occasionally communicate with the firm as well. So roughly chronologically, that brings us up to The Gift of Fear. Gavin's book came out in 1997. So parallel to this, I'll go into a little bit more about my story, and then it'll kind of link up chronologically. So I came to SAM for the CJ program. I'm originally from Longview, up in the northeast part of the state, a couple hours east of Dallas. And when I was drawn to the CJ program, though didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it, or what direction I was going in. Lived on campus, was in the honors program, was in those other programs. My dorm is now a hole in the ground with a bunch of bulldozers around it. So time is a flat circle. And so in that, I'm here taking classes, and literally 1997, this was halfway through when I was here, Gift of Fear comes out. And I read Gift of Fear here, literally, while I was taking classes, and I used the analogy to compare it to that scene in Back to the Future, where he says, that new sound you're looking for, will listen to this. That was kind of the instinctive hook that I had at the time. And I felt like when I was here, the paths for CJ at the time, in terms of the degree, were police systems and practices, corrections, and then kind of a not otherwise assigned, kind of an academic route, if you will. And so I started taking, and like I mentioned, I minored in English and psychology, and so I had a lot of a nexus with, like Dr. Kircher and crossover with the psych department. So a lot of I took all the classes I could that kind of straddled that divide. And so my degree was the BA CJ without the other specializations. So what was it about the book in particular? And there's a lot, but in terms of broad concepts that I was responding to, the notion of seeing risk and threat assessment as a behavior is not a discrete beginning and end act. There is a trail that goes back before and after, and what we're interested about is the before, and that these patterns are moving along, these behaviors are moving along a continuum, and the goal is to interdict earlier in that continuum with resources, other things that you can help with to try to disrupt that overall pattern, and we'll get more into that in a minute. And because there's the popular media conception around when there's an act of violence that rates that much media attention that, oh, well, they just snapped. And I think we all know to some degree that no one just snaps. That's not how human behavior operates. So the more we can learn about that process, the more options we have from an intervention standpoint. And it's often in the terms of, a lot of times it gets talked about in terms of a predictive model or something like that, and that's not necessarily the main goal. The main goal, there is a predictive element to it, but it's a predictive element around an allocation of resources. Because if you're looking at behaviors of concern, people of concern, you have a wide body to choose from, and you're having to make decisions about where to allocate intervention resources. So that's kind of the grit of what we're getting into, and that also was what really struck me. And there were other concepts around the differences between anxiety and fear, and how we create a lot of things that we label anxiety, though fear is a holdover from earlier evolutionary times that's sending us a very real, distinct signal in the presence of danger, and kind of the differences between those, and how to tell the difference and what to pay attention to. So anyway, so that's kind of the broad strokes. I was particularly interested in the company. I thought he wrote well. It was just something that was really interesting to me. When I did my internship program here under Dr. Barham, I interned with the Brazos County Attorney's Office doing investigative work with them, but at that time, part of the elective was you had to write up to other agencies that you were considering applying for, and one of them that I wrote about back in '98, because I did the internship a little early, was Gavin de Becker Associates. So chronologically and just historically, at that point, I met my wife here. She was also in CJ. We married shortly after we graduated, and we didn't know exactly what we wanted to do, but she wanted to join one of the police departments. Applied with the major metropolitan ones. We wanted Austin. She wanted Austin because it was the more progressive department of the ones we were choosing from. She got into Austin, and so that's where we ultimately decided to move. Now, side story on that, she later made some other career decisions, taught high school for a little while, and now teaches kindergarten. So, all roads lead back to Rome. So anyway, so we're in Austin, and my first professional job was post-degree, was with statewide intake under what was then the Texas Department of Protective and Regulatory Services. So I was doing intake risk assessment for child and adult protective services through their centralized hotline. So the centralized hotline came on in the late 90s, where statewide you're reporting to one central 1-800 number. And e-reporting came along when I was there too, but that was very much in its infancy, and it's a much bigger structure of it now. So what we were doing was, like I said, one number for abuse and neglect concerns for children, the elderly and disabled, daycares, and people in state facilities, state hospitals, group homes, things like that. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all the time, right? So it was shift work, and it was interviewing, triaging, and doing basically triaging threat assessments, because what people would call in, they would tell us the narrative, we would interview them, and then we would have to do a spot threat assessment on that information to say, if it met the guidelines for something we could refer on, and if so, what priority, what allegation, all based on what was in the Texas Family Code. So that was, I liken that to, that was very much, like an emergency room in the sense of the very quick turnaround. Once you were out of training and on your own, you were doing 14, 15, 20 of those like micro triaging risk assessments a day, all day, every day. On to the next one, on to the next one. Didn't really know outcomes or next steps or anything like that. You were focused literally on that initial piece. And then also you had to be able to articulate verbally with the person you're interviewing with, and then in writing for the agency that you're sending the information to, why it was what you were saying it was. You had to be able to support your allegations and your assessment. The hardest, and again, I'm sharing this just in complete candor, the hardest part of that job was the volume and the repetition and when you had to tell people no, that whatever they were calling about didn't meet the guidelines to be able to refer on for investigation. Because then, from their perspective, and rightfully so, what they were hearing was what they were calling in to talk about was not important. So it would be, so what has to happen? Does the baby have to die? Does something that you're killing my baby? All day, every day. And I don't want to, that wasn't 100% of the interactions that you had, but it was a solid percentage, and there's a cumulative element of that over time. My first shift with statewide intake was Sunday through Wednesday, 10 o'clock in the morning until 8:30 at night. It was four 10-hour days. And I didn't know when I started with that shift, but soon learned that every other weekend is non-custodial parent weekend for, with kids. And so on the Sundays, working on those days, you would start off the day and you would get the calls from the parents the non-custodial parents who had the kids for the visitation, whatever the issues were, didn't want to give the kids back at the end of the visitation. So we had to navigate that, which we didn't have any control over, but we had to talk them through. And then at second half of the day would be them calling the other guardians or parents, calling once they had the child back to report everything that happened with the non-custodial parent. That was every other weekend on Sunday. So in addition to everything else, there was that too. So I did that shift for about a year before I transferred to a Monday through Friday, like a more traditional hours, but it's a 24-hour operation, so people could suit their shifts to meet their schedules if they had unique needs of working nights or childcare, whatever it was. And then my last year or so with statewide intake, I was in what was called the Expedited Background Check Unit, which was a hybrid program with DPS that we could do searches for criminal history and abuse and neglect history for situations when workers in the field had made the decision to remove and were screening prospective placements. So we would do that and be, and be a part of that process. So like I said, that was about my last year or so. And yeah, and then, full disclosure to kind of give color for this as well. Halfway through my time at statewide intake, so I was 25, on my first time going to the doctor as an adult, I was diagnosed with what later became, I had bone cancer in my leg. And so that 2002 into 2003, there was chemo, surgery, and the recovery and everything else that goes with that. 2004, recovery, learning to walk again with the prosthetic, all of that stuff. And I say all of that to say that I learned a lot in terms of interaction in situations with high criticality. And I didn't have this awareness then, but it was laying foundations for stuff that would come later. Because, and I'm going to talk about this, but managing victim fear is a very real part of what we do and what you will do in whatever capacity you end up serving in. And so just as an example, the orthopedic oncologist, the doctor that ended up doing the surgery, had a conversation with him that was basically the abbreviated version. What have they told you about what's going on in your leg? Me saying, oh, well, it's either a cyst or a tumor. And he says, well, it's not a cyst, and we hadn't done anything at that point. He could just tell. And then I was told with about as much emotion as I'm relating to you, that if it were in my lungs, there's not anything they could do. And if I didn't do, either way, if I didn't do any treatment, I had 3 months. And by the way, that scan to find out if it's in my lungs wasn't until the following morning. So, great time had by all that night. And so literally that speech with about as much intonation as I just said what I said. Doctor walks out of the room, resident medicals, because this was UT San Antonio, medical branch. Medical students come up, and immediately after that, how are you doing? I laughed. I literally laughed in their face at the absurdity of it, right? So all of this stuff was planting kind of in the back of my brain, like interactions, again, with high criticality. So there's that. That's midway through my time at statewide intake. Toward the end of my time at statewide intake, I knew that I was ready for a change, but I didn't necessarily know what that change was going to be. I applied for a supervisor position and got a supervisor position at statewide intake, though the way the shift system worked, I would have to do a year on nights before I could go to days. And again, at that time, my wife had transitioned, was a high school English teacher, and a year on nights would have just completely upended our rhythm. And so I declined. I stayed in the EBC unit at that point and was kind of looking at other options. Parallel to all this, I had always kept GDBA in the back of my mind. And I think I have, right. So I'd always kept GDBA in the back of my mind. And I'd check on the website in the early days of the internet, things like that. They would post for positions for the Protective Security Division, which is the bulk of the company. And I'll talk more about what the company actually does later. And eventually they posted a position in the Threat Assessment and Management Division. So I applied in Los Angeles. So I was living in Austin at the time, in Pflugerville. I applied for the position, didn't get it in the initial round, but another position opened up about approximately 8 months later. And so they reached out for that and offered to do the interview and went out. The interview went well, and on the day that my wife's high school, the high school where my wife was teaching, on the day they had their graduation, I called to tell her that we got offered the job, or I got offered the job. So we were looking for a change. It was time to do something different, so we did. We put our house on the market. We loaded up no kids at that point. We had 3 dogs. Loaded up our 3 dogs and drove halfway across the country. So I lived in Hollywood, not that part, if you've ever been. This is in the flats and not particularly, not particularly exciting in any way, shape, or form. The whole notion of available parking being a thing of the past, and all kinds of other adjustments and things like that. So my primary practice at the time when I started as an analyst with the Threat Assessment and Management Unit, and at that time, TAM, we did threat assessment and we did investigations under one roof, under one house. It was a team of about 5 of us on the day-to-day with other experts that we would consult with. And so in the beginning, I was reviewing inappropriate communications to public figures, and so that's media figures, corporate figures, government figures, anything along the lines, interpersonal situations, things like that. And we were also doing pre-employment and confidential background investigations. So I was a licensed PI in California eventually once I had the years in order to do that and to take the exam. And so that was the bulk of what I was doing. And I slowly rose up, or not slowly, but I rose up over the time that I was there. So this was 2006 to 2012. And then in 2011, our twins were born. In 2012, I wanted to explore opportunities to move back to Texas, be closer to family, all of those things. And so we explored working remotely. And so we moved back in 2012, and I have worked remotely since then. So went through case manager, senior case manager, and then more recently, as of a couple of months ago, I'm the director of case management, which means that I oversee the team of analysts and case managers that are reviewing the inappropriate communications. And we have since, it's grown so much that the company is now around 800 plus people. And threat assessment is now under the risk management umbrella, which includes TAM, threat assessment management, what I do, investigations, and we have an arm for intelligence, which is like Ghost Center operations, intelligence analysts, threat analysts, and things like that. A lot of those are corporate embed or corporate assigned positions, but a lot of it is feeding off of this stream of threat management. And that whole team that all of those branches that I described are probably 30 to 40 people in a company of about 825. So anyway, just giving that to get a little bit of metric there. And okay, so that, now the roads have kind of converged a little bit in terms of chronologically telling the story. And I'm not trying to do like a lecture or death by PowerPoint, but if you're not familiar with this model, this is something that is heavily relied on in the threat assessment field. So Calhoun and Weston wrote a book called Hunters and Howlers, and then are very active in this space academically. And this was floating around in some different areas, but they were the ones that kind of codified it and put it out there in the journals and things like that. So it kind of became the accepted norm on the academic side, that as you can see, this is what we refer to as the pathway to intended violence. Now, obviously there are different domains for intended violence. There's, there's public figure where there's no existing relationship, domestic violence, interpersonal, where there is some kind of existing relationship. Then you have corporate, and then you have, and by corporate I mean, employer-employee type dynamics, and also just, intentional ideological violence, mass shootings, making statements, that kind of thing. But all of them, while there are different dynamics for all of those, there is this kind of foundational element for this pathway to intended violence. So what I was talking about in the beginning about trying to, you have more options and intervention options earlier on that dynamic. The later you get on that dynamic, your options are more limited, and once you're all the way up, it becomes a tactical situation. So your options for some kind of formal threat assessment intervention at that point are fairly limited, but there's still certainly a role to play. So this is kind of the pathway that we're talking about. This is what we're seeking to disrupt. And with that, so how do we do that? What do we do? Someone comes to us with an inappropriate communication. What are we looking for? What are we looking to tell them? And again, I'm not trying to teach this per se, but I am trying to give enough of a context so you guys have it to help inform decision making. So academically, and by academically I mean in terms of journal space and things like that, there are so few, taken in total, successful public figure attacks, and by successful I mean all the way to some kind of act of violence, that if you look at it straight statistically, any intervention, your significance or your odds of impacting, are relatively low. But that said, that's not particularly comforting to say to a victim that, well, statistically, anything you do, you're likely to end up in the similar, like if you're just looking at it from a statistical model. But clearly, that's not how people live their lives, because if that's what it is, all you need to do is tell people, drive safely, wear your seatbelt, and, moderate diet and exercise, and you'll be fine if you look in terms of what's actually, causes a health hazard to you. But that's not what people want to hear. So I say that to say that there are all kinds of options that you have for intervention decisions. And I'm going to I'll leave that up there for a bit, and you're not looking to kind of memorize that, but I'm sharing that in terms of what I said earlier about the continuum between less of an intrusive intervention to more of an intrusive intervention. And what we mean by that is less of an intrusive intervention is one that typically the person of concern, the pursuer, the stalker, whatever terminology, is not aware of the interventions. Because once the individual becomes aware of the interventions, the narrative can change and your options can change. And it depends on what kind of resources you have to deploy, because clearly the Secret Service with their threat assessment model, and they have also been on this general model since the mid-90s, this general threat assessment model. They have a lot more interventions to apply. They have a lot more options to choose from, and their formal involvement is not necessarily as, it's kind of part of it. It's not as surprising. But an individual receiving a communication is not going to have the same level of resources. So they don't have that to deploy. They're often not able to speak to therapists, other law enforcement, family members, things like that. So they have to manage it earlier on that continuum, because were the individual to learn of the concern or these actions being taken, in some ways and in some situations, particularly mentally ill, pursuit of public figures, it can exacerbate the situation. It can make things worse. So that's always kind of the balance that you're trying to strike in terms of at the actual practitioner level. So in that, I want to give a couple of really brief. So what do I actually deal with? What actually comes across my desk? What am I actually doing? A lot of it is the inappropriate communications themselves. People are writing now, people are emailing. But we've also had the targeted travel is obviously a lot more. That's an escalation if they're actually seeking an encounter and showing up somewhere. And I can give examples of we had one pursuer that over 5+ years now has communicated persistently with his target, has visited residences in multiple states, opposite ends of the country, in an attempt to seek an encounter, has been incarcerated twice, once associated with the inappropriate communications, and another time separately, didn't have anything to do with this, but he was still incarcerated for a pretty good amount of time. Continued to communicate throughout all that. Even after some of his arrests, his phone call, the proverbial phone call from jail, was to the principal to try to make contact. Again, like that's how deep it goes. So a lot of the more traditional interventions have been applied, but the underlying behavior doesn't necessarily go away. So much like a medical condition, it becomes managing that situation over time. His particular delusions are fixated around perceived romantic relationship with the individual he's communicating with. Another situation, another person also engaged in targeted travel, traveled literally all the way across the country to seek an encounter along the lines of he felt that this particular recipient, this public figure, that he in fact was this public figure. And that was the name that he gave when anyone that would ask him who he was, referred to as capgrass. And that he would oftentimes, if you would ask him who he was, he would give the name of this public figure. Then if you asked him for ID, he would say, well, no, I'm a sovereign citizen, so I don't believe in ID, essentially, right? So that was his kind of workaround. And it was entrenched. And he also ended up in the criminal justice system. He actually got deferred into their mental health model where he had to undergo treatment for months, even to be able to stand trial on the criminal charges, because there were some other things that were ultimately found out. It wasn't directly associated with the communications, but that was part of it. And ultimately, he's still in the deferred adjudication program, and then part of his program is that he can only refer to himself by his true name, because that delusion doesn't go away. The definition of delusion is fixed false belief, which means that this is not a matter of just telling someone, oh, they actually don't know who you are, and you're actually not, Franklin Roosevelt or whatever it is, and that's not what his delusion was. So there's the phrase from the book that's like straight talk doesn't work with crooked people, and that's not a judgment or a reflection. It's just more of the traditional approach is not going to work in all circumstances. So you need tools in the toolbox to deal with that. I am going to read text a little bit, so we're on intervention decisions. So apologies for just reading flat out, but if you haven't heard this is now the FBI's definition of threat assessment. It is a systemic, fact-based method of investigation and examination that blends the collection and analysis of multiple sources of information with published research, practitioner experience, focused on an individual's pattern of thinking and behavior to determine whether and what extent a person of concern is moving toward an attack. So that's that pathway to intended violence that I was talking about. So this comes from an FBI study on multiple shooter incidents from 2015. If you're in the threat assessment field or that's your general interest, if you haven't seen it, you can Google it. The PDF is right there. It's very interesting. And I say all that because now that this is going more and more into the corporate model, this is overall the model that's being adopted. So this language is moving out into larger spaces. So Threat assessment field at large, we generally tend to focus on the least intrusive interventions first to try to apply those, because you can't unring the bell on some of the more intrusive interventions. And again, all cases are different, so I'm not trying to give one prescriptive model. I'm just talking about in general about the toolbox that we pull from. And then obviously more intrusive things like criminal charges, restraining orders, things like that, we will help the clients navigate that if that's the situation that they're in, and we think that would be, that would be of value. We'll help them do that. There's also something called the intimacy effect, if you're familiar with that, which is basically that threats of intended violence in situations where there actually is a relationship, an interpersonal relationship, carry more weight than threats of intended violence, generally speaking, towards someone where there's no existing relationship. So in the public figure sphere, generally speaking, any successful attack to the point of violence has not been preceded by an actual direct threat. It's been preceded by what they refer to as leakage, which is, people finding manifestos, like comments to neighbors and parents and things like that. So there's information there, and the goal is to kind of spread this out more across the threat assessment model. So those are kind of like, one individual cases on things, but we also, more and more a sphere for this that I want to put out there so people are aware of it is volume of inappropriate communications. If you think briefly, the effort that it took to write the letter, get the envelope, do whatever you're going to do, print it, write it, whatever it is, put the stamp on it, get it in the mail, whereas now it's an email or it's a tweet or it's social media, whatever that is. So if you can imagine, and this is something obviously that the Secret Service and other agencies are having to deal with now, because the threshold of buy-in to send that off with your thumbs is minuscule compared to what it has been historically. And this is a new space for a lot of things. People are contending what's the best way to manage this, what bears more significance compared to something else. Just for, like we have one client that generally receives north of 6,000 communications a month. And that's individual inappropriate communications, print, email, social media, all of it all together. And those trends are only increasing. It's only going up. So that's kind of the overall, that's the space that we're operating in. That's what that's what my area of expertise is. And I want to impart two other things that I want to impart here, and I want to make sure we have time for questions, and I don't want to keep you past anyone's allotted time. So managing victim fear, I want to speak to this piece particularly because I think this is an area that we are kind of pioneering the space in, that I don't know that there's as much attention being paid to this, because the threat assessment piece is one piece, but part of that is you have to manage the fear of that victim, and the fear is going to be different based on the footprint for that particular person. Like somebody with full Secret Service level coverage might be less concerned about a particular communication than someone that doesn't have those resources in place. But either way, they are looking to you to manage their fear, to help manage their fear. And that duality, that's where the art meets the science, I think, because that you can develop a case management plan, you can do all of those things, but if the client, the victim, doesn't have buy-in, and this is true if you're with an agency, whatever your situation is, you're going to come across this in some way, shape, or form. If the client doesn't have buy-in for what you're trying to put forward, they're not going to comply, which can impact their safety and a bunch of other things. So what I want to impart here, the 4 C's: care, confidence, certainty, and communication. And I'm not going to belabor this, but I just want to plant these in your thinking. Care. From the client's or victim's perspective, do you care about me? Are you seeing me, or am I just another case? Am I just another number? Am I just another statistic? Do you think I'm crazy? Do you think I'm just another case? This all goes to, because if they don't think that you care, they are not going to trust you. They're not going to follow your recommendations. Along those lines, confidence. Are you a vessel for my confidence? Are you good at what you do? Can you keep the facts straight? One-on-one, much like talking to your doctor. If your doctor's fumbling through whatever it's going to be, how confident are you going to be with whatever that doctor then tells you? Again, big thing, if they don't have confidence as you as an individual in your presentation, they're not going to have confidence in your recommendations. Certainty. From their perspective, you're battling their uncertainty. their uncertainty. So whatever you can do to increase that certainty is going to be of value to them. And so we might not be able to say, we don't do line item predictions. We can't tell you when someone is going to do this particular thing. We can tell you where it's trending, what it looks like, but we can't tell you, on Tuesday, that's going to be the day, unless there's something clearly communicated along those lines. But do what you can to inject certainty in those communications. This is when I'm going to call you. This is when I'm going to follow up. This is where we're going to meet for the court hearing. This is what you can expect for our office to do, or our agency to do. All of those things help to build that certainty. And then the last one is communication. You can't dodge their phone calls. You can't dodge their emails. They want to hear from you because that's part of managing victim fear. If you're just an empty voice on the other side of the email, on the other side of the line, again, you're not going to be doing that piece of managing their victim fear. Because what gets lost sometimes, particularly from agency perspectives when you have volume, the managing victim fear is part of managing the case. It's not a separate discipline, it's not a separate area. It is part of the actual work. Okay, so with that, managing victim fear. Okay, future trends. I want to go real quick, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. Where do I think some of this is going? Like when you guys are in the field, what's going to be more impactful? What are you guys going to be seeing? First thing, I did bring up Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. You can Google them, look up their website. There is a Texas chapter. It's nationwide. There is a Texas chapter. They operate out of Austin, Dallas, and San Antonio. They have student memberships for people that are in school, and they do meetings, and those meetings are also trainings. So they'll have a presenter come up and talk about targeted violence, talk about domestic violence, talk about law enforcement interventions, and they have started live streaming those meetings. So check that out if you have an opportunity. Those are very good resources. The current president of the Texas chapter of ATAP is a SAM CJ grad, so there's a lot of crossover in that. Other thing I wanted to mention, where do I think a lot of this is going? I think the volume is going to continue to be an issue. Like I said, the lower threshold to actually send the communications. So if it's going to be AI, if it's going to be different tools to help manage that and triage that, I think that's going to be where a lot of the friction and growth is going to be on a lot of these models. And I think ultimately there's going to be more community and agency involvement. I think that if you're not familiar with it, Congressman Brian Babin, who I believe is in one of the neighboring districts, has introduced what's called the TAPS Act, Threat Assessment and Public Safety, and the goal of that legislation, it's been introduced in the last two sessions, and ATAP is kind of behind it or has participated with it, but the goal of that is to introduce this threat assessment model and provide grant money for trainings for community agencies and across the board, private sector, places of worship, schools, law enforcement, the whole thing, really everything that you need to actually create a threat assessment team and threat assessment model. And so it's a big push to kind of systematize that, because I think there's going to be more of a community buy-in around that, particularly with these incidents of mass violence. People are talking about what can we do, and this is looking at things in a more holistic way as opposed to like a particular, like one particular fix, because it's not one particular fix, it's community-wide. And the mental health, gradual expansion, because I think the thinking around threat assessment, I think, is similar to where the thinking was around suicide prevention and domestic violence 30 plus years ago. There's information there, there are tools there, we know more than what we are applying. And I'm not saying there's one right way in every situation, but I am saying that we know more than what typically gets applied. And so kind of my goal partly with this is to help inform some of those conversations so that can be taken out. And so, all right, real quick, GDBA today. Like I said, approximately 800 people in the company. We are actively recruiting in multiple divisions: protective security, threat assessment and management, investigations, and intel and threat analyst side. There's some material in the back if you're interested. You can also just Google the company name, find our website. There's a lot of really good information on the website if that's something that you're interested in. Currently, generally, if you into the nitty-gritty of where the jobs are, it's nationwide, but the biggest pull right now where they're looking for people is West Coast, so LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Arizona, and East Coast. Atlanta, and then up the East Coast. But there, like I said, positions, there are presences nationwide. Also, GI Bill, I want to mention this briefly. In California, the training from the company qualifies under the GI Bill as well, so there's a stipend if anybody is exiting. That is basically like an additional income source for that. Okay, and getting into the end, and again, anybody stop me with questions, but this is the last thing that I wanted to get across. More of what I wish I had known, what I wish somebody had told me 20 plus years ago. Although I think a lot of it was covered in what I said. This is kind of veering off a little bit, but I think it's something that bears worth repeating. All of you, whatever work you end up in, you're not going to be selling widgets. You're not working at a bank. There's nothing wrong with any of those. Those are very noble endeavors, but that's not what we're talking about. And I think people can kind of academically say, okay, yeah, I get that. But once you're into it, once you're doing it, the repetition into the nitty-gritty of it, you find a way to manage your stress by managing your stress. Not by doing all the other things that you do to try to manage your stress, to kind of like self-medicate, to kind of, like get on the surface of it, because that works until it doesn't, and then when it doesn't, you've got a problem. And I think that there's, the effect that this work can have, and it's work that I'm still in and I love and I continue to do, but don't discount the effect that this work can have on your bodies, can have on your relationships. So you have to find a way to connect to that at the body level, to find a way that works for you to manage your stress. That's exercise, meditation, therapy. I don't know, there are so many paths, it doesn't matter, but you have to find the one that works for you. And the earlier you start, the better, because it's a lot easier to build on something existing that will grow and change than to try to transplant something on top, years later, once things have gone down the line. And I know, and there's a lot of stuff out there. Jerry Colonna, his stuff is really good. There's a book called Trauma Stewardship that is really good. Joan Halifax is a PhD sociologist, but she has a model called the GRACE program that came out of end-of-life care in the medical field. Google any of that, and there's some really great information in there. So that's kind of on the day-to-day, and I think the other thing that can get lost sometimes is whatever you end up doing, whatever field agency, whatever you end up doing, in the beginning and all the way through, this is a deep practice of slow repetition, because the learning, it's foundational. It's not just like, oh, hey, I got that. I read about that. I can go off and do these things. So you have, whatever you end up doing, you have to build that foundation. So always make sure you're paying attention to that and thinking through that lens, because that will, that will serve you as you go forward. So with that, questions, comments, observations, anything that would be helpful for me to talk about. And I'm also, feel free to come up one-on-one after if this format is not to your liking. I'm happy to talk that way as well. Anybody? Anybody? Yes, sir.
So in terms of finding those threats, is it actual field work that you do? Like, do you follow up on it?
Yeah, sometimes. Now, obviously it's not going to be as, like, the Secret Service has a much more robust model for things like that, because they can do a lot more, like being in the field, talking to family, like all of that stuff. But generally that is an option, and that is things that we do. But it's kind of it's part of a diagnosis, but it's not, or a treatment plan, I should say, but it's not the right treatment plan for every situation. Sometimes it's a question of resources, like would we be in a different position, especially, I don't want to use the phrase back in the day, but back in the day, there used to be a lot more of that, because pre-social media, sometimes the only way to get direct, actionable information on what somebody is doing was surveillance or talking to people or something like that. Now, there are real downsides associated with that, and it is very resource intensive, but that used to be done a lot more, and I just mean across the board. These days, more often than not, somebody's putting it all up on some social media somewhere. So it's a question of allocating resources and what the right balance is. So short answer is yes, but it's not, I don't want to say it like it's prescriptive, that's something that we do every time, but it is something that you can consider. The big thing with that is you don't want to take steps that that by design or inadvertently might be learned about by the pursuer, because that can make the situation worse. That can actually have implications for life safety. So you have to thread that balance very carefully. Does that answer your question? Cool, yeah. Yeah, the question, okay, well, I'll paraphrase, but let me know if I get it right. The question was how much of the work is field work based versus how much is done, let's say research style or something like that, or just reviewing the actual communications. Because obviously, company is headquartered in Los Angeles. That's where I worked for a number of years. Now I work remote. We have people that work in the headquarters. We have people that work remote. So everybody's kind of coming at it geographically, generally from different places. A lot of commuting, like telecommuting and, like things like that. Yes, sir. Generally speaking, that's a good question. Question was why is the hotbed on the West Coast, right? A lot of it is client-based, so that's like the clients that are looking for these particular services happen to be based on the West Coast. The company originated in Los Angeles, and so a lot of it kind of grew organically out from that. I don't want to say that there aren't opportunities in other places, but again, like you said, the hotbeds are in that area. But it's Los Angeles, a lot of public figure work there and a lot of other things. San Francisco is a big tech field with the stuff going on there, and then same with Seattle, kind of up that way. So a lot of that is client-driven as opposed to geography-driven. Is that good? Yep. Anybody else? Yes, sir. That's a very good question. Okay, so and I understand if people need to go, I'll repeat the question. So question was, what are the challenges with working remotely? And that is a good question because I think more and more that's going to become a norm for a lot of people, at least part of the time, if not full time. A lot of my challenges, or let's say the challenges, is that I am overseeing a team that I am not geographically located with. So we do a lot of conference calls, we do a lot of webcam, things like that. I travel out a few times a year to be physically present because it feels like that, because there's a lot of things that you can't do other ways. But I think the challenges, it's not so much the work, because I think the work, like everybody's on, I think the work kind of lends itself to, especially now with like the software platforms where you can do things like that. It's not the work, it's the soft skills related things, it's the intangible related things. So like you're on that conference call, you're on that meeting, but you're not kind of standing around for that informal collaboration after and things like that. So it can lead to a kind of a distancing that you kind of have to navigate. And also working full-time remote is not for everybody. I know people kind of say, oh, I'd love to work from home, but there's an isolation aspect to it. There are some other things that you have to actively manage, and I get why, some people that have the option don't necessarily want to do it or don't want to do it full time, because there is an element of not being physically present in the office where it is something that we have to navigate. And I think the biggest challenge is just not being physically present, especially when you're talking about things like their progression or promotion and things like that, kind of like the more, HR is not the right word, but kind of like those more conversations that aren't necessarily assessment related, they're work related and pathway related and things like that. Because everyone's kind of on a continuum to mastery. That's the model that we try to inspire, and kind of being there to actually kind of help through. Webcam is easier when you can be physically seen. I have had the experience that like some of those calls over speakerphone are lacking, and you don't really know until you're in it, and you get that instinctive feel that like this is not the right medium for this. So I think it's just kind of the logistics of juggling some of those things. But work-wise, I don't find there to be, in terms of the work itself, I think the challenges are now manageable with the technology. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Sure.
And what I recall from it the most was very big into empowering the victim.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was wondering what you do in your role.
Yeah.
What does your team do in your role?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that goes back to the managing victim fear. Okay, so sorry. The question was empowering the victim, and how does that translate? Because that's a theme of the book, arguably the theme of the book. And how does that translate into what we do? A lot of our piece with that is the managing victim fear piece, and I think that's entwined with the recommendations, because it's not just take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, right? Like if that's all you're getting across, your chances of follow through or making an impact are very limited. So a lot of it is And the managing victim fear piece is an interesting piece because that's the solo practice. That's kind of the one-on-one piece. Like, does that person have confidence in me? Does that person have confidence in what we're relaying? Because there's the foundation of the book and, and Gavin's practices and things like that. But when you're right down into it, I'm not Gavin, that person doesn't know me, so I still have to do something to bridge that connection. So to answer your question more succinctly, a lot of what we do, like we said, managing victim fear, empowering that, because a lot of times what we might recommend is some version of watch and wait, like not an active intervention, and then we have to tell them why that we think that serves their best long-term safety as opposed to some of the other options. So in terms of what we actually do, a lot of it's those 4 C's: care, confidence, certainty, and communication. So one, I want them to know that I care about their individual situation. I want them to know that what we are going to do, what we can speak to with certainty, why they should have confidence in us, and more importantly, the empowering piece comes in, for me personally, oftentimes it's either articulating, here is why these recommendations serve your autonomy and serve your best interest around privacy and safety over time. And showing them that, one, they can have confidence in this, and two, we try to help them see, like, we're not counselors, that's not our role or goal, but we do want to help them see that a lot of this element that they don't have control over, but here are the things that they do have control over, and here are the steps that they can take, and here's how this is impactful. So it's not just wishful thinking, it's not just, it's not dismissive in any way, shape, or form. So if you can tie it around those, that's a lot of what, it's tying the recommendations around that piece to instill that. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. Very good question. So the question was, do we hire more straight out of undergrad, or is it generally looking for experience? And the short answer is, it all just depends. There's not a straight model. It depends on, because oftentimes on the protective security side, people are transitioning out of the military. So, I mean, not everybody, obviously, but a good percentage. So it's not necessarily a straight out of the degree situation with them. It's slightly different. Generally speaking, on our side, the team that I'm a part of now, if it were the right candidate who was coming out of, we would certainly encourage them to apply, because it's not automatic. It doesn't rule them out in any way, shape, or form. Generally speaking, we have a lot of people that are coming in with masters, just because that's kind of where the field is right now. But it's not a requirement. We have one person. All of the team now has their masters. I don't, but the rest of the team has their masters. We have one team member who has a PhD in epidemiology that is doing threat assessment as a kind of a second career, and then we have another team member that is working on finishing their PhD in forensic psychology. So it's a pretty good mix across the disciplines. But then we also have team members who came in right out with an undergrad. So it really just depends. And I would encourage everybody, and I should have put this up before people started to depart, take a look at the website. There's a lot of the career information is on there, the different tracks, the different positions that we're looking for. There's also some literature in the back of the room, but the website is a much better resource because it's got a lot more information and a lot more stuff that you can draw from that way. That's my contact information. Feel free to, I'm happy to answer any more questions, or I'm happy to discuss one-on-one. Yes, ma'am.
What can students who are interested in this, what can they be doing, especially if they're not seniors yet?
Right.
What can they be doing now?
Yeah, absolutely.
How to better prepare them to be the type of person that you would hire?
That would look for, yeah, definitely. So yeah. Question, yes. Question was, what can people do as before they finish their degree to be more towards something that we would look at to hire. On the protective security side, I would say it's pretty open. It's like if they're working on the path toward their degree, physical fitness, all of those things, the general things like you would for applying for a police department, although we might be a little more stringent in some things, but like that general model, if they're doing that, I would say that they're certainly competitive along that path. The other positions, like the threat assessment management, investigations, things like that, look for, like I said, I kind of straddled that psychology element with that, but that's not a requirement in any, in any way, shape, or form. Really, we're open to any undergrad degree if there's, if we think there's, applicability and interest. So don't let that limit anything. I did mention ATAP, the organization. So they also have, they put out the academic journal, the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management. That is the, it's the only journal. There are other derivatives that do different pieces on the psych side and the CJ side, but it's the only one kind of under this umbrella that's straight threat assessment and management. That, I mean, it's academic, but that's a really good resource also to be aware of. I think those trainings that we mentioned for the ATAP meetings would be really good just for general knowledge. And also, I know everybody's resources and time are limited, but make sure that you're reading in your interest, right? Like, don't completely neglect that. And if your interest is literature, if your interest is whatever it is, I don't want to put a narrow path on it, but anything that your interests are following, I think will help facilitate with language and communication, and that's ultimately what what anyone is going to be looking for. So I don't think there's one path. I think there's many paths, but broadly speaking, that would be it. And obviously, if you're interested in investigations, there are a lot of companies that do variations of it. So if you're looking to get experience on that before looking at other ones, you can find organizations that can help with that, and firms that can help with that. But again, there's no, on the other side, like the investigations, the threat assessment side, the other ones, the degree, and as long as you can meet the criteria in terms of background issues and things like that, we're certainly open to considering. Yes, ma'am. That's a good question. It would depend if they are legally authorized, if they're able to be employed, right? Like if there's not an employment issue. Legally, I don't think that would be an issue, but I don't know if there might be issues around security clearance related things that just jurisdictionally, it wouldn't necessarily disqualify them for employment, but there might be certain details or certain assignments that because of additional security requirements might or might not be the right fit. But again, I would encourage them to look at the website. It's not a deal breaker. If they're legally able to work in the United States. Yeah, sure, right. But if there's not a legal bar to employment, again, that's a very good question, and so I don't want to speak for HR, but it's not. I'm not aware of any reason that it would be a deal breaker, and anyone we would encourage to apply and have that conversation. Yes, ma'am. Go for it. Yes, if it's the right, yeah, that's a very good question. Okay, does the company do internships? Yeah, thank you, sorry. Yes, if it's the right fit and the right applicant. We don't have there's not like every semester we work through a set number of people, but if there is someone that is interested, I would encourage them to reach out and we can explore if it might be a good fit. Because historically we have, but it's, like I said, it's not something that we have like 5 people come through each semester on a set program. It would have to be the right fit and the right need at the time. Anybody else? Good? All right, well, thank you all for coming. Feel free to reach out or feel free to come talk to me one-on-one if that's easier for you.